Do you think Keir Starmer is in serious trouble and will be replaced?
I think he'd be in serious trouble if we don't get our act together, because the opinion polls are awful. The feeling of bewilderment by the electorate, I put it no stronger than that, is palpable. The only way that Keir Starmer can stop a challenge in the future to his premiership is by getting the act together. It's about delivering, being competent.
Has Keir Starmer got what it takes? Well, we're joined in the studio now by Lord Blunkett, David Blunkett, and by Barley, who is resting peacefully at his feet.
Barley is the guide dog. I ought to explain that. Otherwise, people might have thought I'd brought somebody in and
total stranger.
laid them out. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, well, I should have done. Thank you for doing my job, which is that you should paint a proper picture, and I hadn't done that. But Barley is a very beautiful dog and sitting there very quietly. Yeah. David, it's good to see you, thanks very much indeed for coming into the studio. Can you make head or tail of what is going on right now at Number 10 and in the government?
Now, I think the world is crazy, and then it gets crazier. And you just wonder, please, let's get some stability, which is what we promised and what we need. We'd had enough turmoil and instability to last us a lifetime with Boris and then Liz Truss, etc. And here we are fighting amongst ourselves, the government lighting its own fires rather than waiting for somebody else to do it. And yet things are going on underneath that are being missed. So it's a double whammy, really. You give the impression of things being out of hand, and at the same time you knock out the good things that you're doing. You knock out the announcement. You avoid people getting a hearing of it.
But can you make sense? Look, you know how government works. You've been at the top of government. You had a succession of ministerial posts. You were close to the centre of power. What is going on in 10 Downing Street today? Because for all the problems that there were, during your time, during the Blair years, it feels sort of just so different now.
Well, to be fair, I mean, I'm got to be fair, not just trying to be fair. We didn't come in on the back of Brexit. We didn't come in on the back of COVID, and maybe we'll talk about that, the kind of legacy that's left us, not least in terms of the hundreds of billions of borrowing that it took to put people on furlough and give the loans and what have you. So we were in a different position. The main other thing that we had was preparation. We had actually done a lot of policy work and preparation before 97, which stood us in very good stead. And I think people around Keir Starmer thought they'd done it, but they actually hadn't. They thought that a vague idea of what you wanted to do was actually policy, and it isn't. And so I think over the last 17 months, they've been fighting to assert themselves over the civil service, who, after 14 years, have got their own ideas. I mean, the typical thing of going in and being told, the minister being told, but this isn't departmental policy, minister. And there's a lot of that yes minister stuff about. So learning to do it, getting control, being very clear what you want to do, and then shifting it. And again, back to Brexit, there's a total inertia in the system.
I want to come back to what's happening now, but I just on that point you've just made about lack of preparation, I remember all the work that was going on with Jonathan Powell, who, in government became Blair's chief of staff, and, meetings with the departments, meeting with the think tanks, devising the policies that you would implement, pretty soon after coming into power. Was it negligence that work wasn't put in?
No, I think partly that there was an expectation that we couldn't pull it off in 2024. So all the attention was on crawling back from the disaster of the election in 2019. And that meant that the thinking was all about winning, and winning in the end with a very small proportion of the total electorate, because only 60% voted and we got 34% of them. So we were aiming at a target audience in circumstances where the Conservatives were going to lose. I mean, it is now clear, isn't it, to us, with the benefit of hindsight, that what people said in July 2024 was, we've had enough of you from Land's End to John O'Groats. So right across the country, in places we'd never have expected to win, people said, we've had enough. And I don't think people before the election had fully clocked that was the case. In fact, they were still arguing after the election as though people hadn't got the message. They were still telling the awful truth about the economy and the misery. And we had the statement at the end of July,
sure,
3 weeks in. And all of that indicated that people hadn't understood what the electorate were thinking and feeling. And what they needed was uplift. They wanted hope. They wanted trajectory. They wanted urgency in the system. And we weren't adjusting, the government weren't adjusting fast enough to that. And Keir Starmer's admitted it, that, you know, the early part of the misery that we were purveying was the wrong message.
So the number 10 operation strikes me that it was all about winning, reversing what happened in 2019, winning in 2024, fighting a lot of internal battles within the Labour Party, marginalising the Corbynistas and all that sort of thing. But that still seems to be going on, that there still seems to be, you know, why are you briefing about Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, when he's about to make announcements on the latest progress he's made?
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, when I've heard people speak, senior people who have remained in Downing Street, because there's been an enormous amount of churn, they are still talking as though we were running up to July last year. And somehow we've got to get out of that. You mentioned Jonathan Powell a minute ago, John. I mean, the great thing about Jonathan Powell in his current role, with his international hat on, helping Keir with international security and everything that goes around it, that is the bit that has worked. Keir Starmer's reputation and the reputation of the UK has been lifted since the general election on the international scene, whether it's defence and security, whether it's on trade. The job's being done and people are recognising it. If only we could translate that to the domestic agenda. And because you mentioned Jonathan Powell, who I didn't always get on with, but is a superb professional, what we need, and I don't think he'd want to do it, in fact I know he's said he doesn't, but we need a Jonathan Powell in Downing Street for the domestic policy.
Right. So you talk about that. The person that does that now is Morgan McSweeney, who's the Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer. While we're on Jonathan Powell, when I was a lobby correspondent at Westminster during the Blair years, I knew Jonathan. He never spoke to journalists.
Ever,
he was,
no.
just absolutely not. Yeah. If you wanted to find out what was happening in Downing Street, you spoke to Alistair Campbell.
Exactly.
Why is Morgan McSweeney, the current Chief of Staff, apparently briefing journalists, dripping poison, when this is something that Keir Starmer doesn't want?
Well, if I could answer that question, I'd be much closer to the operation than I am, so let me not pretend. And secondly, I'd have been able to persuade Keir Starmer to do something about it. I'm not ducking your question. You floated it as a rhetorical question, so I'm floating it back. Who on earth could have made this up? So I think Keir is incredibly loyal to people who have worked with him over years. Finding the right niche for them, I'm not talking necessarily about ditching them, because he doesn't want to do that, but finding the right niche for people is about building a team, and we've still got time to do it. But I think if Keir were sat with us now, I would say you can do it. You're doing it internationally. Let's replicate that on the domestic front and let's win people over, because the only way that Keir Starmer can stop a challenge in the future to his premiership is by getting the act together. It's about delivering, being competent, being seen to be generating not only the activity that's going on, but the narrative that explains to people what's going on under the surface. I mean, I could list you, and I won't, because it would drive your podcast audience completely mad, but the enormous amount of things that have either started or have already been put in place that nobody knows about. And they don't know about it because all the froth that goes on and the lack of a clear message that comes out. And to get a hearing these days, but particularly with social media, you need that very focused, laser-like,
Yeah.
programme.
So let me ask you two specifics. Should Morgan McSweeney go as Chief of Staff?
Well, if I were Keir Starmer, I would say to Morgan, look, you've got great skills. You helped enormously with me in building a winning team before the election. Now's the time for me to find you another role that you're good at, and I will bring someone in with the overall experience that we need to be the Chief of Staff. It's a particular role. It's about knowing about government and managing. It's about having been in a senior position where you've had to not only run the show, but manage people well. And that isn't rocket science, but it's a particular skill. And we all have different skills. I mean, my skill was very different, say, to Tony Blair's, which is why when he built a team, he was looking for people who complemented what he could do.
Sure.
Yeah.
And given the current trajectory, another specific question, do you think Keir Starmer is in serious trouble and will be replaced?
I think you'd be in serious trouble if we don't get our act together, because the opinion polls are awful. The feeling of bewilderment by the electorate, I put it no stronger than that, is palpable. We have a very focused alternative to the traditional two-party system, with not only reform, but obviously with the Greens and the Liberal Democrats. So if people have a choice that they feel comfortable with, then you've got a real challenge to win them back. It's not impossible. I mean, goodness me, if we don't, and this is a challenge for those who would vote Lib Dem or Green, or even the old, traditional Macmillan, Disraeli type Conservatives, if we don't get our act together in the next 3 years, who is it? I just pose this question. Who is it that is actually really going to benefit? It's going to be Nigel Farage. So we shouldn't fear him, but we should take him on, and by doing that, win people back. And I come back to it. It's about putting the good policies together. It's about overcoming this lethargy and inertia and inertia in the system. The civil service are working, God bless them, at a fraction of the rate that they were in 97 when we came in, with the energy and drive that went with it. They have this awful phrase that has started to inculcate speeches. It's called, "We are working at pace." What a load of rubbish. I mean, they've got another one, which is "We stand ready," which means we got up this morning. These are, we get new words coming in like agency that nobody out there knows what the hell we're talking about. So it's not, I said a minute or two ago, it's not rocket science, but it will take a material shift to actually move gears. I'm answering all your questions as honestly and robustly
David,
as I can.
This is the joy of a podcast, where you can have a proper conversation about politics and the ideas and what is going on, and it's a joy to have you here doing that right now. If you can hear a little rattle, that's
the dog having a scratch.
That's Barley having a scratch.
He says he's heard it all before.
I think he thinks I think Barley's worried you're being too honest in your replies.
Well, I may be for my own good.
Okay, well, let me ask you another question then, which is, you've said what needs to happen to turn this round. Do you think that Keir Starmer has got the political skills to do that? You look at what Blair did and the way he operated, and you compare it to the way Starmer... Take the welfare reform thing, which gets voted down, no preparation, Labour backbenchers are angry, there's no attempt to kind of mollify them, there's no good narrative about why these welfare changes are being made, and despite a huge majority, Labour has to back down. So, narrow question, has Keir Starmer got what it takes?
Yes, but it doesn't take one individual. The great strength of Tony Blair was that he put a team together and allowed them to get on with things and to be able to think through collectively how to do it. So whilst, I've remained a friend of Tony's when he was being slagged off, I was one of the people who continued to defend him, because I think he was a brilliant Prime Minister, and history will accord him that status. But one of his great strengths, apart from intuition, knowing how people felt and reacted and being able to reach out to people who Labour had not touched for a very long time, was building a team. And I mentioned Keir's performance internationally. He has demonstrated with that he can do it, but he's got to avoid this terrible "where is Keir, he's not here" stuff by really focusing now, because he's had to focus on international affairs for the last 12, 16 months. Now I think is the moment to say, I'm not going to anything unless I really have to. I'm going to send other colleagues and concentrate on building a team around him in Downing Street, but more importantly, from my point of view, building the political team and allowing them to get on with it, instead of kids in Downing Street ringing them up and telling them what they should be doing. That is the wrong way round. When anybody rang me up from Downing Street, or if the private secretary came in and said, Downing Street doesn't like this, my answer was, who? There isn't a Downing Street. There are individuals. Do they know more than I knew? Were they clever than me? Did they have more political nous than I had? Well, actually, I was arrogant to believe that they didn't. So I used to ring Tony and say, is this your will? Or has somebody misinterpreted it? And I'd normally get the answer, get on with it.
What's so interesting of what I hear about the current operation and the way it works is that Keir Starmer has contracted out policy and politics to Morgan McSweeney. He's contracted out economy to Rachel Reeves. He's contracted out communications to Tim Allen, who you'll know, who's come back in from the Blair years. And that he doesn't, he's not involved in any of it. It all passes him by. And that's why you end up with Morgan McSweeney apparently briefing press that, Wes Streeting's got to wind his neck in.
Well, I don't know whether that's true, but in a perverse way, I'll just turn this on its head. I hope for the immediate past you are right, because if you're right, then Keir getting engaged on a minute-by-minute basis, actually taking control and working with political colleagues will be the answer out of this. Because if you're wrong, then there's a real implication there that would worry me greatly.
So we've got the budget coming up in 2 weeks' time, and it looks like Rachel Reeves is going to clearly break the manifesto pledge of no rise in income tax. It's a hell of a calculation to make, because on the one hand it's the simplest and most obvious thing to do, and look, to use the vogue phrase, there's been a lot of pitch rolling on that right now. What would you say?
I'd say, firstly, take a long view. I think we've got ourselves in a real pickle with the Office for Budget Responsibility and their impact on the markets. I don't ever remember a government, and I've challenged economists on this, believing that they could forecast so-called because it was never invented until recently, headroom in 4 years' time. Chancellors didn't put themselves under such restriction. Even George Osborne, who brought this Office of Budget Responsibility in 2013 as a monetarist restrictive measure, because he believed in monetarism. I don't. So firstly, we've got to be much more long-term ambitious about how we can balance the books. I agree we've got to balance the books. And therefore the fiscal rules are self-imposed. Secondly, what do the OBR, this three-man team with a secretariat behind them, it is 3 men, by the way, what do they know that the rest of us don't know, that economists can't make judgments on, given the uncertainties of the impact of artificial intelligence, of that improvement in productivity, in reskilling the nation? What do they know that we don't know? And then thirdly, if you really do believe that you've got to take drastic measures that will affect the attitude of the bond markets and the algorithms that go with it, because, by the way, for the audience, that's how it works. It's bizarre, but algorithms click in, and they then affect the bond interest rates. And we've got to say, what is it that's absolutely imperative? And if she believes she's got to raise sufficient money to actually go for the big ticket numbers, and she's not prepared to break the promise on VAT and the impact that might have on growth, then it's going to have to be something as big as raising income tax. The clever ploy here is that you reduce national insurance. So for those on PAYE, those on a normal earnings pattern, will actually be protected. However, it's the top line that matters. It's not. I mean, I'm not against raising income tax. I used to argue with Gordon about it 20 years ago. It used to then, paradoxically, be a view from the left of the party. Now I notice that left-wingers, including the new deputy leader, are against it. So we've come full circle. If we believe that things are so bad that they can't really get worse for us in the opinion polls, then I could see why they would do it. But honestly, it's going to take a lot of recovering from.
It's going to take a lot of recovering from, and it's going to take a lot of explaining, which is, again, I would say something that this government is not very good at, of telling its story, of what it's doing, of where we as a country are heading, and what the kind of underpinning values are of it.
Yeah, well, we told a story before the election and then beat it to death afterwards about the black hole. What we didn't say was the black hole, behind the black hole, was the COVID borrowing. So nobody's, in my hearing over the recent months, I've never heard anybody re-spell out the hundreds of billions that were borrowed, understandably, in order to try and prop up the economy and pay people to do nothing on furlough for very large periods of time. That's partly, by the way, I think a reason for the lethargy and the inertia that we've still got in our public life and in our economy.
I'm really interested in this idea. You've mentioned it a few times.
I'm
now.
Sorry, because I'm obsessed with it.
No,
as the listeners will gather.
I'm really interested. Are you saying now that the bunch of ministers that are running the country are sort of, I mean, low energy, lethargic, a bit meh, can't quite get their act together, can't quite do it?
Oh, I'm saying that ministers are intent on driving the energy levels up, but the whole system has a slower trajectory. The perspective on what can be done quickly has dropped enormously. So even good things that we say we're going to do, we are doing them on a elongated timescale, because I think senior officials are coming to ministers and saying, seriously, we don't have the capacity and we think it will take this length of time. And even when we're doing things that I'm totally in favour of, like saying if young people 16 to 24 been unemployed for a very long period of time, we should give them the job. When we came in 97, so I've been here, I'm not preaching something that I haven't done. We said 6 months. We'll give you a menu. If you've been unemployed for 6 months, you've got to take one of these 4 options. And we rolled it out in 11 months across the whole of the UK. And it took the Department for Education 11 months to set up the Board of Skills England. That's now been moved into the Department for Work and Pensions. And I think it's been moved in order that work and pensions can join the system up, but also perhaps put some energy into the system. Because, let me just finish. When I came in 97, there were 2 parts of the department. One was education and one was employment. And the bit that helped us drive this forward with an excellent permanent secretary, Michael Bishard, who'd come from the employment side of the department, was those in the employment field. And they helped us drive the department in an entirely new way.
So let me ask you this then, because you talk about the overhang of COVID and the impact that has had. I mean, if you look at the welfare bill, the number of people claiming sickness benefits, ballooning, and yet the government seems incapable of achieving any kind of welfare reform measure. I mean, another policy that looks like it's going to be, loosened in the budget is the two-child cap, which I think you're opposed to.
I'm opposed to a blanket lifting of it. I'm not opposed to a much more sophisticated, targeted
Why are you
approach.
opposed to a blanket list?
Because if you've got £3.5 billion to spend, some of it clearly needs to be spent on those families with more than two children, where there's disability, where someone has been widowed, and therefore there isn't a second partner on the scene to earn and contribute, and where this would actually help people to help themselves, so that you could put supported with the rest of the money into proper supportive childcare linked to training. You could put support into the family directly to help the children. The work that Bridget Phillipson's done on breakfast clubs, on expanding massively, nobody knows about this either, entitlement to free school meals, those are a direct benefit to the children who are living in poverty. That is feeding them. That is nurturing them. So if you've got £3.5 billion, and I would like Rachel to raise that kind of money for anti-child poverty, then some of it needs to be diverted into helping people to help themselves. Cash transfer can have an immediate amelioratory effect if the families use the resource for the children, and most of them would, but it ameliorates poverty. It doesn't dig them out of poverty. And that's the challenge.
Yeah.
It makes me very unpopular. I've had
numerous
discussions with Save the Children and the anti-child poverty campaigners, and they've been very respectful, and I'm respecting their view. I think they've won, but I think that there are other ways of helping which are much more holistic and joined up.
So the caricature of your policy is, well, if you give people more money, they're just going to have more children.
Well, actually, the Tories did think that in 2017 when they brought the cap in. Here's a twist. It didn't make any difference. People carried on having more than two children, and sometimes they were in a position where they could afford it and they'd made a conscious decision, and then things went drastically wrong, which is why I wouldn't blanket keep the two-child cap full stop. And just for your listeners as well, because some of them will be getting very aggravated by now with me. I grew up in absolute poverty after my dad was killed in a works accident when I was a child. And my mum was therefore a widow, and she was very ill and couldn't work. And we managed on the kind of poverty line which is unthinkable now. And every day I have to nip myself and remind myself where I came from and what it was like, and then remind myself just how well off I am now, and how dare I preach these things when I've never been in a better, more comfortable position financially than I am today. So I'm mindful of, being a bloody hypocrite, and I'm trying not to be. I'm trying to say cash transfers do something, but they're not the sole answer, and you need to win people over to make that kind of welfare system possible, so that people who are making conscious decisions not to have more children because they can't afford it have to be won over, that their money that they're contributing is going genuinely to changing the life chances of other people's children.
When the Starmer government tried to introduce those welfare reform measures in the summer and failed, do you look at the welfare bill and think it's just ballooning ridiculously? If you look at us compared to a lot of other, G7 countries, the costs of COVID are still way higher here than they are in competitor nations.
Yeah, their recovery has been much quicker.
What do you put that down to?
In every
what's
sense,
wrong in Britain that we're not doing that?
Mental health and wise, as well as the practicalities, they've recovered more quickly. And
But why? What's
well,
what are we,
I've
are we? Is our system too soft? Are we just mollycoddling people when we're, people are saying, "I'm feeling a bit stressed. I don't think I can come to
Well,
work today."
look, I'm a Labour politician completely committed behind the Labour government. So let me tell you what I think. I think that we've inherited a terrible mess and that we've not moved fast enough to be able to compensate and then to do something long term about it. You rightly raise the issue of the welfare state and the ballooning figures. The more the welfare budget raises, the demands the raising of money to pay for it, the less that money is available to actually invest in stopping people being in that position in the first place. It's a no-brainer. So we have to have, once Stephen Timms has finished his work, and Alan Milburn, who I'm very pleased that Pat McFadden as Secretary of State at Work and Pensions is appointed to take a look at the 16 to 24-year-olds. When I was talking to Pat 3 or 4 weeks ago, I said, Alan Milburn would be a great person to do this because he chaired the Mobility Commission, Social Mobility Commission, and he did some work in a neighbouring area to me back in Yorkshire, in Barnsley. And he will be able to do a job. We've got in the next 9 months to come up with a set of policies that will pull back on that bill. It won't penalise and punish people who are really in need of financial support, but it will interrogate those who are applying and then give them an alternative out of a cash transfer. If you've got a mental health problem, giving you more money doesn't actually help you. What you need is the right support at the right time to be able to get over it. And part of that will be getting you into a job, by the way, because work helps us. When I've been down, it's been work and friendship and love and people around me that's got me out of it.
So, I mean, yeah, look, that all sounds so commonsensical, what you say, that the bill is too high. They need to have a look at what's happening in 16 to 24-year-olds. You've got to kind of help people, da-da-da-da-da. Will it get through the House of Commons? I mean, the Labour MPs there seems to be so much less loyalty.
It's not loyalty. There's a very large number of people came into the House who didn't expect to.
Who think they're going to be out anyway.
Well, they're overwhelmingly, forgive me, all of you, forgive me, but they're overwhelmingly middle class. And, we are a Labour Party, not a welfare party. So we've got to find a way out of this dilemma. And it is a dilemma. Why would you want to hurt people who genuinely need health-related benefits or personal independence payment? You wouldn't want to hurt them. You'd want to find a way of enabling them not to have to rely on those particular benefits. Now, some people will need to, because for some people, what's called PIP will enable them to get a job. It will be the little bit that I take for granted now because I can afford to pay somebody when I need to drive me somewhere, to actually be able to continue doing what I'm doing, or pay my assistant, because I do now pay someone myself because we don't get staffing in the laws. I can, for a whole variety of reasons, I can afford to do that. I'm blessed. To help people to help themselves is where the money should go. But you don't compensate somebody for a mental health problem, for stress, by giving them money. You help them by helping to get them out of it.
So
it's a no-brainer, really.
I just want to touch on one other topic, which is immigration.
We're doing everything here, aren't we? We're doing all the difficult bits.
Well, I'm not going to give you the easy stuff.
No,
What's the point of that?
Well, goodbye. What do you want to talk about immigration?
Well, look, I was the BBC's Paris correspondent, I think, when you did the deal with Sarkozy.
That's correct.
Yeah,
2002.
Exactly. Yeah, and I was there when that all got signed, and it was kind of sunny uplands, and it was going to be a new start. And look today, and we've got these small boats coming across. Do you think that the architecture that we've currently got, the ECHR, the 1951 Refugee Convention, are fit for purpose, given the flows of people moving right now for a whole bunch of different pull and push reasons?
Well, taking the ECHR, I'm very clear. that we should stay in it, but argue for improvement and modernisation, but we should derogate. I used the term a few months ago of suspend, but it's called derogate from particular articles, Article 8 and Article 3. People don't need to know the absolute detail, but they're the ones that only sometimes get in the way when the judiciary rule that what you're trying to do, which may be common sense, actually breaches one of those articles. So we just may need to derogate. I think that the difficulty that Shabana Mahmood has, who's a really tough woman, I mean, she's been in the job, less than 3 months. I think in the next few days, she'll be making more substantial announcements on policy. Her difficulty...
You know that?
Her difficulty is that the French government is unstable. They've only just managed to put one together. I had the advantage of being able to negotiate with a tough guy, Sarkozy, who of course has just been released from prison. But he knew what he wanted to do, and he had the power to do it, and we could reach a deal. If Shabana could reach a deal with the current Interior Minister, say to license everything that could be described as a craft that would carry more than 6 people, because you wouldn't want to license children's dinghies. But if you could license them, then they could intervene in the warehouses. The police and security services in France could then intervene, and they could stop the boats reaching the coast. At the moment, you can't stop the boats until they've been launched and people are trying to get in them. And then you've got all the arguments about marine law and all the rest of it. So whatever she's going to say or do in the next few weeks, it will be really important that we understand that we need the French with us to make it work.
So we've talked about all the difficult issues. We've talked about the economy. We've talked about running Downing Street. We've talked about immigration. We've talked about welfare reform. Do you think, looking back, that governing has become more difficult because of the pressures of social media, all sorts of changes, than they were when you became the government in 1997?
Yes, materially more difficult, much more difficult. So that's why I'm not slagging off colleagues. I mean, if people thought I was slagging off colleagues, you would see me if I really was. I believe that they've got a hell of a job on their hands. And communication is so much more difficult. When I was Home Secretary, if I went on television, I would almost guarantee on the evening BBC and ITV news, and then eventually Sky, that I would reach, if I was fortunate, between 10 and 15 million people on that evening. Now it's down to 2 or 3 million, and I'd have to deal with social media, which is really dominated by the far right. I mean, the fact that Tommy Robinson, or whatever his real name is, actually could reach so many people that he can, to get them to gather in Trafalgar Square. That to me is an indication of enormous change and challenge for a left of centre government. And that means new forms of communication. It means trying to reach people in a different way. But here's a thought before we finish. I'd like us to be much more communitarian. So I'd like a lot of our policies to be about building from the neighbourhood upwards. And some of our ministers are preaching that, but the bureaucracy is doing the very opposite. So if we could get more communitarian engagement in the community, that's where people's lives really are at. And that's where we could win them back, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's in local government. We have a devolution bill which talks about empowering communities, which does nothing of the sort. It was invented, presumably, by officials who have no concept of what I'm talking about when I talk about Robert Putnam and communitarianism.
Okay, so when you describe what happened with Tommy Robinson and the huge numbers of people who came out to support him, let me end with this kind of question that opinion pollsters ask. David Blunkett, are you optimist or pessimist for the future?
Oh, I'm an optimist. I wouldn't have been a member of the Labour Party, God help me, for what now, 60 63 years.
You're giving stuff away here.
63 years if I wasn't an optimist. I've been through hell and back. I've been on the heights of success and the lows, the valleys of despair. But I still remain absolutely an optimist, both about my party, about the government, and about our country. And in the end, it is all of us, the country, that needs to change and not just government.
David Blunkett, lovely to have you in the studio. Thank you very much indeed.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.